on by Luigi Russi, who's a student. So what's exceptionally, really just exciting for us today is the fact that a student really single-handedly organized this workshop, brought really interesting speakers to us today, and we're just excited to see this happening. The other thing that's interesting is the topic, and so I just want to take 2 minutes, lay out some initial thoughts on the topic without framing it too much, and then we'll just jump right into it. And so the idea, contested spaces, identity, religion, and resistance. At the IUC, there is a general push to try to reimagine the language by which the global governance, economy, and market is operating, whether this takes the language of the commons or some other register. And this seems to tap into that feeling again, but I wanted to bring up just a few specific points. So the first is that in the ideas of identity, religion, and resistance, we see conceptual categories, and we see the challenge, one, to not allow them to be reified. We want to denaturalize them and all those sort of words we use. But on the other hand, that they are contested spaces or operating together within a contested space, we're thinking of questions of how these organizational subjects operate within given settings. So we're not only talking about ideology and how the logic will manifest itself, but we're specifically trying to think, and so we're getting away from questions of representation and identity, to questions about the relation between these concepts in a broader formal system of structured processes. In other words, what does this formal organization entail? And the other thing I think that comes out in looking at the papers is that there's less description than explanation. So there's a latent normative aspiration that's going on here in the very words of resistance or contesting ideas of identity, which lays out ideas of emancipation. And I think the question that seems to pop up, I hope, or I think I see, maybe I'm reading in, is again, how these different organizational arrangements or concepts specifically produce various relations of production or vice versa. So what is the relationship between these ideas and the underlying forces or relations of production? Or vice versa, if we want to challenge the current organizational pattern, how do we even understand how that organization really works? And how could we imagine doing something different? So if we're going to critique a bourgeois state, for example, in a Marxist register, how exactly does the organizational processes of the state actually reflect those underlying social structures? And how would we do it? So, really interested to hear what you guys have to say today. And let's just get right into it. We're going to have a talk, then a break, and then we're going to have another talk and some discussants, and then we'll have lunch. We'll come back for one more session, and then we'll have some concluding remarks and we'll be done. Okay.
The presentation I'll be giving today is connected to an independent research project that I have been able to undertake here at the IUC. So the full title of my project is Autonomy and Authenticity, the battle for common sense in the age of consumer capitalism. However, for reasons of timing, I will be focusing mostly on autonomy and authenticity, so there won't be much common sense or battle in my presentation. There will be a little bit of consumer capitalism. So before I delve into the presentation, I have to thank my sponsors for funding my studies here at the IUC. These are the Fondazione CRT and the Fondazione Giovanni Guria, who are sponsoring my studies here through their Master dei Talenti della Società Civile department. And I also wish to thank the directors of the Institute for the Study of Political Economy and Law, John and Saki. And I also wish to thank Pepe and Antonio for the logistics and helping to put this together. So my presentation is divided into roughly 3 parts. Although this one is really bloated and these 2 are quite small, I would say. So in the first section, I will try to introduce why studying autonomy and authenticity. It doesn't look immediately practical. So why should we go and study conceptions of the individual? Then in the second part, I delve into autonomy and authenticity, which are not all possible conceptions of the individual. They are the 2 that I focus on. And then I will try very briefly to bring everything together in relation to consumerism in the third part. So, why is it important to study conceptions of the individual? My idea is that once we have a model of individual agency and of individual motivation and commitment, we tend to use it in order to ask it questions on how we should design our society and our institutions. So I will start with a few examples. I had the pleasure to attend a talk by Terry Irwin, who's a professor of design at Carnegie Mellon University. And I was really struck by how she showed how depending on the conception of the individual, on the type of individual that the designer has in mind when he or she is designing something, the outcome of the design process might actually be very different. So depending on the individual you have in mind, you have different design outcomes. So she discussed 2 types of human dwellings. Now I cannot show you the pictures for copyright reasons, so you have to work with your imagination. She gave an example of a dwelling of a retirement home in Arizona. So you have to think of this as an aerial view of a landscape. And in this retirement home, so where you have all these homes, those would be the clusters of homes, which really looked, they were made with the same materials in a standardized way. Then at the center of the retirement home, sort of this dwelling, you had a mall. And this was surrounded by a golf course, and that was in the desert. So what kind of people did the person who designed this dwelling have in mind? I thought it must have been, well, this design didn't really communicate a sense of place. So you're in the desert, and yet you have a golf course. And also, what did that person think? How did that person think that people would interact? So people, they have their own personalized experience in their homes, and then they get together to shop. And she contrasted this with, so this is, again, think of an aerial picture of a Mexican fisherman's village, where the houses were kind of spread out and about, and so there was no standardization, because the materials were kind of taken from the surrounding context, and the shape of the dwelling was actually adapting to the environment. And at the center of this dwelling there was a square, so there was a much greater sense of place and of connectedness to that place in this type of design. And so you have 2 different ideas of individuality which play out in different design outcomes. There's another example I want to bring, and that is education. I read this really interesting book by Gay Tuckman, she's a professor at the University of Connecticut. She wrote this book called Wannabe You, and it's sort of the story of Wannabe U, which is a university, sort of an imaginary university in the US, who is trying to climb up the rankings. Of course, she's a bit critical of that. And in this quote, she's basically coming to terms with bringing to attention the fact that education has become more of a preparation for the job market, rather than a place where you can actually have meaningful intellectual exploration. Now that's a caricature, but this should sort of represent the current model of education that we have, which is sort of a product, I would say, of the Industrial Revolution, of the idea of the need to prepare a class that is able to manage the processes of the economy. And what conception of the individual do you think we find in this process? In order to find that out, I actually went into some critical pedagogy, and Paulo Freire, who you might know, and he complained about this blank slate idea of the learner. So the student is a blank slate. You have to fill him or her with knowledge, which the student is supposed to be able to replicate in an exam setting, and then outside of the exam setting in the job market. So there's a kind of passivity embedded in the way the very system is designed, based on a certain idea of how individuals learn. And then, unexpectedly, an interesting critic of that is Maria Montessori, who wrote a very transient section in one of her books, which is called From Childhood to Adolescence. So she basically, well, you might know Montessori education, and you might have looked at a Montessori classroom, which hardly looks like a classroom, really. And her idea is that individuals are not simply blank slates, but they have certain modes that they naturally relate to the environment, and harnessing those is actually helps people undertake their learning. One of these ideas is, for instance, that of embodied learning. So she said adolescent students should actually be involved in the management of a real house and be working with the land in order to learn, for instance, principles of economics. So that's a radically different view of the individual, which is translated in a radically different design of education. So this is why it is important to study what kind of models of the individuals we work with. And I want to start with autonomy. The reason I begin with autonomy is that it is, I would say, the dominant view of the individual, at least in economics today. I consider it a modern concept, and maybe we can discuss it in the Q&A with Taha. Because I know maybe you don't agree with my sort of conceptualization of the autonomous individual as modern. The reason why I think it's a modern as opposed to postmodern ideal is that it has an essentialist bent, meaning that it assumes that there is a universal individual that acts in certain ways. So you can take people from any place, and you can model their action in a rational way, in basically the same way for everybody. So the historical genesis of the idea of autonomy. Another thing I want to say about autonomy is that. So why calling it autonomy? Autonomy in the sense that you act based on desires which you have, and you're not affected by the world in how you have those desires. So you just have those desires and you act on the world. And the historical genesis of this is a bit debated. So some say that it can already be traced back to the onset of Protestantism, with the idea that you reject the external rituals of the Catholic Church because faith is an inward movement in yourself. I personally sympathize with the view that aligns it with the onset of modern scientific thinking for instance, Descartes' thinking of the duality between subject and object, so that the world is basically a mechanism for the individual to dominate and discover in this one-way movement from the individual to the world. And then, of course, we find it also in contractarian views of society, because, well, according to Hobbes, society was basically a product of individuals coming together. And actually, these ideas, so the reason that autonomy is so dominant is because, for instance, we can recall Margaret Thatcher saying that there is no such thing as a society, but there are only individuals. And I think she also mentioned families. This idea of the individual is, I would say, the main justifying tool for consumer theory. The idea of consumer theory is that your preferences are there with you before you do anything. And so then you flock to the market to satisfy these needs that you have independently conceived in a way. And this, of course, this takes a further strange bent with the idea of revealed preference, because Samuelson is this American economist who said, we cannot know what people wish because we cannot get into their minds. Therefore, we will use as a proxy what they do on the market. So the problem is that this leads to a kind of deformation in the focus of how you study the individual, because the moment you only study what the individual expresses, for instance, in market behavior, it seems as though the only needs that matter are those that can be expressed in market behavior. And it also leads to buying and to the consumerist ethos, a kind of expressivist stand. So when I'm a consumer, I'm really empowered because I'm expressing my essential self to the world. So this is so much about autonomy. Then I focused on authenticity. Authenticity is, well, it means many things. The strand of authenticity that I've worked with comes from communitarian philosophy, in particular with Charles Taylor. At least that's where I started from. And essentially, so we can say that the authenticity is a postmodern deconstruction of the individual. So it says there is no such thing as the individual, there are many individuals. Actually, the very notion of individuality that people take on themselves are projected onto them by society. And so this, we can look at it as an opposite dialectical movement from autonomy. Because autonomy said there is the individual who acts on the world and is not affected by the world in no way. So from the individual to the world. And this postmodern view of authenticity seems to go the opposite way. So it says there is no such thing as the individual. It's the world that projects its image onto the individual. And the individual is just rehearses narratives, that social narratives that are cast onto the individual himself. So there is then a debate as to how you can find a middle way between these two opposite poles. And that comes in the form of reflexive authenticity. So it is true, I mean, individuals do get affected by, are subject to social influences, but still they are able to reflect on those influences in order to decide to what extent and how they will be affected by society, and to play out, so to remix, you could say, these influences into their own authentic identity, you could say. And so this actually leads to a feedback situation. So you have the individual that is affected by society. The individual then reflects on these influences and plays them out in his or her own original or authentic way. And then in acting, he's changing those narratives again. So this generates a feedback system. And so this idea, for instance, is expressed by John Davis, who's a political economist at the Timbergen Institute. And so the interesting question at this point becomes, so how does the individual reflect upon social influences? Can we delve deeper into that? So yeah, we said the individual remixes these social influences into an authentic self. How does that happen? That's an interesting question that I thought I would ask. There is an Italian philosopher called Alessandro Ferrara, who has reflected at length on this, on the idea of reflexive judgment. And he says, when the individual decides how to play out social narratives in his own original way in his life, he doesn't resort to a general principle of authenticity, a general rule, and then he applies that in his own particular case in a kind of deductive judgment, so from the general rule to the particular, but it's a judgment that has an inherently aesthetic dimension, and it's not based on pre-existing criteria. This gets a bit tangled here, and I'll try to unpack it further on. So basically, an example is when we look at, say, a painting, and we say that that is beautiful, well, there is no idea of beauty, of what it is to be beautiful, or a general criterion, a rule that we can apply to the Mona Lisa and say, yes, it is beautiful. However, when I say that the Mona Lisa is beautiful, I'm not just saying I think the Mona Lisa is beautiful and that's my idiosyncratic Luigi preference, but in my claim that it is beautiful, there is a universal appeal in the sense that I expect that its beauty will be recognized by other people as well. So, yeah, this is, well, basically Alessandro Ferrara says that when we make an aesthetic judgment, we don't say that it conveys our idiosyncratic preferences, so me just saying I think it is beautiful. But it's a statement which everyone should agree on, and which therefore possesses a universal dimension. So we find a paradox here, because there is no general rules that you apply. You do a particular judgment, and yet it has a universal appeal. This is an interesting paradox. So, the idea is, so that where are we at right now then? So we said that this idea of reflexive authenticity states that individuals are affected by society. They reflect upon these influences, fashioning them in their own authentic identities. And there is no a priori criterion, there is no general rule as to what it means to be authentic. But yet, when we say that something is authentic, we have a universal claim. It is a big puzzle. So I try to delve deeper into this question and try to, I try to find out what it is that gives an individual judgment a universal appeal. And I turn to, so the idea that what might make it give a universal appeal is whether to try and explore whether there are natural modes of being that affect our being authentic, our own self-judgment. So these natural modes of being, of course, we cannot frame as general rules, and otherwise we will no longer be in a kind of aesthetic dimension of judgment. So if we say there is a general rule, then it's no longer an aesthetic judgment because I'm using a rule and it doesn't come from myself. But how does the universal claim happen? And to try and explain that, I've turned to archetypal psychology. So some of you might know Carl Jung. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist, and he had this idea that there are two types of unconscious. There is the personal unconscious, which is the thoughts that are not there for your own, are not in your conscious attention, and that's your personal unconscious. And then you have a collective unconscious, which is a rather fuzzy concept to many people. And this collective unconscious consists of archetypes. Now, this definition of archetypes that I've given is not actually taken from Jung, but from Stevens, who's a psychologist at Oxford. And so archetypes can be defined as neuropsychic centers that contain the blueprint of the basic relationships that men and women have between themselves and with the environment. So essentially this, I can try to explain this with an example that Stevens himself gives. So when we think of this definition of archetypes is taken from an ethological perspective, ethology being the comparative study of animals, humans being just another animal. So when we think about a dog, we think, well, dogs are naturally social. We tend to say that, there is this thing about dogs which they get along with men. So what if, like the hypothesis that this Stevens makes is, what if men and women are not just born as clean slates, that they can, so that the way they have desires is just completely random, but they have some kind of natural conditioning that is there that is there as a result of evolution, really, and this conditioning can be described in the form of archetypes. So the nice example he gives is about the mother archetype. So he says, what if the idea that the mother archetype is already present at birth in people, and it can be awakened upon receiving certain feedback from the world. So when the mother feeds the son, that kind of positive feedback from the world awakens the mother archetype in the son, so that the son recognizes that person as his or her mother. And when the mother receives the kind of impulse back from the son or daughter, that feedback ignites her son archetype, and she identifies that person as her son. So this mother-son relationship is, you could say, has been crafty over the time of the evolution of our species, and so we are sort of evolutionarily predisposed to that kind of behavior. And so we can then say, we could then extend this and say, well, what other, could we say that we have other inherent predispositions as human animals? Are we maybe inherently territorial? So we look for a sense of place. A sense of place is an important part in our lives, and it's inherently fulfilling to be able to live out that archetype in a fulfilling way. So this is an ethological approach to human behavior, as I said. So in the next slide, now I sort of ridiculed it actually, but the idea is trying to sort of see parallels, like if you see man as an animal and try to see certain how society is sort of organized around man, we can then challenge this organization and saying, well, I mean, maybe we have, are we not considering, say, the relationship to place or to the environment? I once had a talk with an Indian scholar actually from Jindal, and he gave me this idea of, he mentioned it in relation to karma, but I think it explains quite nicely the idea of archetype that I want to give. So we think we're free because we're actually on a leash that is really, really, really long. So we have a lot of freedom to roam around, but the leash is still there. So the question is, how far can you push it before you take it to a kind of breaking point? So much about the idea of authenticity, about archetypal psychology, but we find this idea that there are innate propensities in humans outside of psychology as well. So for instance, Marx, and I thank Bhabani for pointing this to me in the book that you gave me, Marx contended that it's important to hold production and consumption together in one's own life. So when you can produce the stuff that you consume, and therefore in doing that, you can sense your own transformative power on the world, that is actually fulfilling because you are relating with your body to the world, and that kind of that fulfills a kind of innate kind of deep need that you have. Whereas in the capitalist economy, you work to produce stuff that you don't consume, to get money to buy stuff that you need but you didn't produce. So this production and consumption are separated, and we are consumers, but we're not really producers of anything, of our clothes, of our food, and so forth. And even Maria Montessori, when she speaks of embodied education, she said, well, we need to have this bodily relationship with the world to learn, because having a bodily relationship with the world is actually for us a way of knowing the world around us as well. So, to summarize my argument about authenticity, what I want to say is that archetypes don't necessarily mean that individual behavior is to unfold in a certain way. So the fact that I mentioned the mother archetype earlier doesn't mean that there is a way, a general way of being a mother that all people should be sort of, should comply with. However, it lets us, it provokes us into thinking that maybe that relationship is something that we all kind of look for, and it can play out in many different ways. So you have variety. In that sense, it's not a general rule that mandates a single outcome. Considering these relationships in crafting an idea of the individual might actually lead to better institutional design, because if you keep these in mind, then you are somewhat enabling people to connect with this with dimensions of fulfillment that might be disregarded otherwise. And so this is a warning to economists, however, so I want to stress once again that the idea of archetypal psychology then seems to reconcile the fact that I make my own individual judgment without thinking before about a general rule of how I can be authentic. But yet, when we see that somebody has been able to play out these archetypal dimensions in his life in a very fulfilling way, we are attracted. So, for instance, actually, Carl Jung himself, the character Carl Jung, was very interesting, and one of the reasons that people listen to Carl Jung is because he was able to integrate many of these archetypal relationships in his own life, and he gave the sort of the outer impression of being a very balanced person. And so, there is no general criterion, but then when you do that, it still commands other people's recognition in a way. So you have this kind of particular enemy person. So, yeah, so then I'm coming to the third part of my presentation, and I'm almost done. So, how does this play out in relation to consumerism? So, the official narrative of consumerism is essentially based on this idea of autonomous individual. So the individual has exogenous preferences that he independently thinks. So this morning I wake up and say, I want a pair of shoes. Maybe I don't want a pair of shoes because I've seen William, the Prince, the Duke of Cambridge, wear those shoes, because that goes against the idea that I'm affected by the environment and my preferences. But I have these preferences and I take them to the market. So that this idea again is very close to the paradigm of autonomous individual, and yet there are many critiques that we can make to that. So, for instance, there is a whole branch of institutional economics which states that actually in our economy we have too many goods chasing too few people. So, in order for the economy to keep growing, the most important business is actually the manufacturing of needs. So, in this actual scenario, individual needs are not exogenous, but they're actually induced by the market, through marketing, for instance. And so Sheehan wrote a whole book about the institution of marketing, sort of a network of silent persuaders that try to make you buy stuff, essentially. And then there's the other critique that I mentioned earlier in relation to archetypal psychology. So when Marx says there is an estrangement of labor, we are consumers but we're not producers. And maybe this feeling of estrangement might actually be connected by the fact that there is really no embodied dimension in that sort of embodied dimension in relationship to the world might actually be lost in singling out only the consumption aspect of people's lives and making it into a whole conception of the individual. So the points I want to bring home, and this is my last slide, is that ideas about individuality affect the shape our society takes. Then I explore different ways of understanding individuals. So we have the autonomous individual, the idea of authentic individual, and then the sort of archetypal twist to authenticity. And depending on the idea of individual that we adopt, we can then we can then critically assess the institutions of our society, one of which is consumerism, but we can choose buildings actually, as I tried to show in the first part, to perform a critique and try to come up with better institutional solutions to a rounder picture of the individual. So thank you for your attention, and these are the sources that I've used. Thank you.
Archetypes and something like that. Why do you think we so naturally came to this particular rationality we have now? And isn't it that something natural led us to the world that we have now? I mean, to this consumerism might be, or can't it be that it's some natural way of our thinking that led us here?
Right. So I've recently been reading a book about natural farming. And this guy, there's a Japanese guy that has been able to resort to an agriculture that is not technology intensive. His name is Masanobu Fukuoka. And in so doing, however, he has been able to obtain yields that are comparable to those you obtain in technological, sort of in fertilizer, artificial agriculture, you could say. And he makes this really interesting statement. He says, when I first came to my dad's orchard, which used to be farmed industrially, I said, I want to stop pruning the trees and see what happens. And the trees, which had been grown by being pruned, eventually died. But then as he was able to take this further and kind of re-educate the trees to grow in their own natural shapes, then there was no longer any need of pruning. So the point I want to illustrate by this example is that I think one of the reasons that we might have arrived to the kind of predicament, our current predicament, is that we have a very strong preference for, I mean, you have to think of the context in which the idea of autonomy was born. So it was a context in which the individual's place was set by religion. So in that respect, there was a willingness to break away from that and say, well, no, I want to understand things intellectually, and he asserted very strongly. However, according to Carl Jung, actually, there are several ways of knowing besides the purely intellectual one. He distinguished between intuition, sensing, feeling, and intellect. So according to Jung, even feeling actually is a dimension of knowing. So if the enclosed place I'm living in actually makes me feel bad, maybe that tells me something about how that place is, and not just that I'm feeling bad and I should take it on myself. So I think that there is a path dependence to the way we have arrived, in the sense that we have very much privilege, we have very much cultivated ourselves, if I can take the tree metaphor, in order to grow in a certain way. And of course, that path dependence has led us to think of other ways of knowing that can maybe allow us to connect to archetypal knowledge, to disregard them. So if we say, let's have a debate about our feelings, you would say, what are you talking about? We don't read our feelings. Feelings are scary and irrational. And yet, maybe the fact that we see feelings that way might be affected by the fact that we never have spent any energies in developing an emotional literacy that would allow us to actually use feelings in order to gather knowledge. So I think there is a path dependency to the prevalence of autonomous individual, because you don't want to tread into a terrain that is not amenable to intellectual inquiry, or only amenable to intellectual inquiry into other dimensions. And so I think that the real challenge is to kind of explore new ways of learning and to sort of re-educate ourselves to connecting with these different ways of learning about the world. So that's my answer. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. And also I have another question. Don't you think that this understanding of reflexive authenticity is a bit dangerous? Because if you say that we understand ourselves depending on surrounding environment, which we know now today is consumption, is this particular rationality, so how we can make a step somewhere forward from this that we have if we are the individuals who are very, who reflect the environment? How to make a step from this environment if we are in it?
This is a very interesting question, because it leads me, so when we ask questions about, say, I even said it in my presentation, we need to come up with ideas of individual to promote institutional design. We always have this engineering flavor in our attempts to structure society. So, and to say, so how do we leave from our current predicament in a structured way that is amenable to intellectual inquiry, and so that we can engineer our way out. And the question that I like to answer, that I would like to sort of throw back, is that in order to unlearn our current pattern, we have to first of all come to redefine what we mean by learning, and from there also what we mean by changing society. So we tend to think of, you change society when you have a bunch of people sitting around the table saying, well, we should do this and that, and look at a few graphs and say, well, that's how. Then we're going to make people connect with this or that other dimension. The point is, how can you teach people to be emotionally literate? Of course, if you or to be, for instance, to use the intellect as one of their inroads to knowledge. And that, of course, requires you to rethink the way you understand education, because you see that education also has an institutional design which is in itself biased. So I think the best way, and that's at least the way I try to put it out in my own life, is that I think it very much starts from an individual effort. And yet, when we confront with each other, so yesterday we were talking with Jovita as well, and we said, well, if we want to reconnect with the environment, I would feel the only stupid person doing that if I changed my own lifestyle in order to be more environmentally friendly. And then I spoke to you and I said, well, why do you think it makes you feel stupid? Let's dwell on your feeling of being stupid. Why does it not feel right? Then in order to change things, then we have to address that feeling. If we say, well, you're stupid if you don't understand the problem of the environment, then we are cutting ourselves apart from a meaningful repository of knowledge, which is your feeling. So how we can go about and make that a generalized program, I don't know. But I think it's a nice starting point. Comes from people's individual efforts. That's not very satisfactory, but that's what I say.
And probably the last question, or just some idea to share. If we have such a good stimulation, let's say from the economy to buy something, and they stimulate actually not only our rational thinking, but I would not agree with that, because they stimulate those inner senses, and they know how to do that, and they stimulate our emotions, our feelings. So having this strong stimulation from this side, from those people who sell something to us, and if we will not offer something strong enough like that on the opposite side, because what you say, you just suggest to come back to ourselves, to listen to ourselves, and somehow to liberate yourself. But how do you imagine to do it without proposing something else which is on the opposite side, or some other stimulation, which is also, I understand, is dangerous, because it also can become particular ideology or something like that. Because how does this liberation of yourself and listening to yourself happen?
Well, for instance, there is an interesting book by an economist called Fritz Schumacher. The book is called Small is Beautiful. And he uses Buddhist economics, actually, to criticize sort of the way the economic system works. So, and he says that it is important to understand that some needs are not necessarily fulfilled by consumption. And that's actually the main claim. Like, if you want a sort of a very concise summary of Buddhist economics, I could say, well, that's it. And how do you come to realize that is a very difficult question that takes us away from accepted notions of academic discourse and takes it into a dimension of personal wisdom. So, for instance, in Buddhist economics, they distinguish between two types of desires. There is what they call ignorant desire, but because of its inability to read itself, projects itself onto things. Therefore, you feel you have an issue and then you buy something. Actually, the whole self-help market feeds on that. The idea that you feel inadequate, what you do, you buy a self-help book. So you have the system in itself has also built certain ways to deal with its own paradoxes that people feel, and they feel bad, and they flock to the self-help market to heal themselves. And the self-help market tells them, well, you should think positive. So that completely individualizes the problem of institutional design. So, and then according to Buddhist economics, then you have a different type of desire, which instead comes through sort of an eightfold path. And I don't want to delve into that any further, but it is very much of a personal experience, really. Gunther Teubner, I think he would answer this question by saying you have to touch the bottom. I think in one of his papers he says it's 1 minute before midnight. So the experience of near catastrophe, sometimes in one's personal life as well, even because consumption has this addictive dimension into it. Because you buy something, then like the main problem with consumer identities is that they're essentially static. They don't understand that an individual's identity is a system, and therefore it flows constantly. So you think that by buying certain products, you can describe yourself to the world in an accurate manner, even though actually the moment you bought something, you're probably already different, and you need to buy something else to assert that identity. So I guess when you come to kind of see this addictive mechanism that is embedded in consumerism, then you can think, as Gunter Pergler probably would suggest, of a near catastrophe moment, and how that plays out in people's lives is very different. So
I would like to encourage more questions.
more questions?
Okay, then I have my last one, second last one. You didn't speak in the presentation about the education system, which you suggest should be reformed. And you say that instead of producing employees, which are just ready for the job market but not ready to think independently, we should change that education. Very practical question. Would you suggest that before, let's say, having particular preparation for profession, we should have that education with no preparation for particular profession, like philosophy, something I like a degree of 2 years, for example, before you choose the right profession, the particular profession? Would it be?
Well, my answer would be very disappointing, actually. Essentially, the reason I have left out, like in my paper, I discuss education in a very long section, and how you can sort of create alternative systems of education. The point is that I have come to double guess my own hunch in the first draft of the paper, because again, when we say let's redesign education, like that, you're treading on a very difficult path of, because are you engineering people again? So in order to provide a radical critique, you also have to see how you're proposing change, and whether whether engineering, I don't know if alternative education works for everybody. You see, I think it would work for me, but then again, what type of alternative education? Montessori education, Steiner education, the Dharma school in Brighton. There are so many different types. So I think, of course, that there is great promise in alternative education, and but I don't know how. Well, I'm also not in education fields, but I don't know how we could actually go about transforming education, especially as long as we remain in an institutional setting and we think university. So maybe Andre might be, he's into popular education and social movements education, grassroots education. So maybe that's also another possible way that, the moment we think, let's engineer education by thinking, school and university, we're maybe not considering other possibilities. So I removed that part from my presentation, and I plan to remove it in the second draft of the paper, precisely because I don't want to cut myself off from other modes of learning and knowing that might also be meaningful.
I have a set of questions real quick. So first of all, just on the basis of, is it even accurate what you're saying? So I challenge you, right? So a few things. First of all, if you're being radical, why care about pushing the leash or seeing how far it goes? That sounds like a call for emancipation or something. Isn't that like the oldest Western trope we got, as opposed to reading the cow or something like that? So why? Secondly, in the story of the modern individual, you link agency with essence. Well, yeah, but not really. I mean, like, a lot of who you are is like not what you do. So it's not that you work in a cubicle and crunch numbers 8 hours a day. It's who you aspire to be, or your sensibilities, or where you go on vacation. All the things that, are sort of like where you don't have to make decisions, or where you're not functioning, right? What you do outside of the grind. Another thing is that the idea of the individual in this context, you seem to challenge ideas of consumer being natural or something, but then you want to reinstate your own individual, authentic, natural, archetypal, so it relates to everybody person. But like Barthelson would say, the individual came out of struggles for authority from Machiavelli that then got brought into the population for issues of rulership, right? So to what degree, where is that in the paper? So what I see is a lot of individuals trying to be reflective, and gosh, we can never maybe one education model, but maybe not, because maybe Jim will feel bad if we do that education model. So what we end up doing is reproducing the very logic you say you don't like, because being a consumer is all about choices, reinventing yourself constantly, and that seems to be again what you're calling for, it sounds like. So to what degree are you just reproducing that? And then finally, education has, maybe the language was talking about truth, and we see philosophy departments falling apart. But to what degree was that conversation about truth always about your quote-unquote job, or about authority? So if I go back to Victorian society, right, it was about having, like going to university was finishing school, right? Now, that was definitely linked to your social status or your place or what you're going to do, right? Even if the conversation was about, you know, the natural world or whatever. So the question would be, you know, questions that would be interesting to me is like, who finances education systems? You know, why are we moving into the social sciences, stuff like that? Okay, those are my questions.
So, okay, could you repeat your first question? Because I remember what I want to say, but I don't remember.
So you just to sum up, you push emancipation, you push, you end up with an idea of subjective individuals, right? You just want more freedom in that. And in each of these ways, it seems to merely reproduce the thing you claim that we're trying to get around. So that, and there's just some examples.
Okay, so
can I just ask, because you can address them together?
Yes, okay.
My question is quite similar to John's. We had plenty of discussions on your topic, and I read your paper other than your discussion. My problem is, you know, to start your discussion in terms of, you know, individual as an abstract individual, and then categorize individuals as authentic individual, ideal, and consumer individual, and, you know, so on. Individuals are product of the society, the product of their space, their time, the people around them. They create the individuals. Bhabani as an individual is product of a system. So to try to link the processes as causality and define individuals is a problem, because you cannot just ignore the selfish individuals in the society, say that, you know, we are good individuals, they are bad individuals. So it's important to understand the forces, the conditions that produce these individuals. In early agricultural society, in medieval society, there was family, there was community, there was, you know, non-consumerist individuals. What led to what led individuals to break away that society, that communitarian life? And now we live in a market society and try to romanticize that new traditional notion of communitarian life, which was often anti-woman and individual by itself. So how do you justify in your paper? Because I subscribe all your argument. At the same time, I find it's a problem to start the debate with the idea of abstract individual. Individuals are product of material conditions, pure material conditions, whether it's identity, religion, or I myself as a consumer, I'm a product of my material conditions. So, can you just elaborate?
Exactly using, I didn't catch it. Individuals are product of what?
Material conditions.
Material.
Okay, so yeah, so in order to the first question that John made, so if you want to be radical, then why then consider a leash? And that actually, I would say the answer I can give to that comes from Alessandro Ferrara, who is the philosopher that that described this idea of reflexive judgment. So when you're thinking authenticity, you step away from a deductive form of judgment, but still you don't give up normativity, which I guess that's where your problem is. You say, well, why, if you want to be radical, why have any sort of norm? And Ferrara says this type of normativity is not based on a general rule, but it's based on exemplarity. So he is confident. And well, I guess if I have to sort of pin where I am, I guess that's sort of my value stand. I think that you can have a kind of exemplarity can be compelling to other individuals. So very often, say when you consider, well, the example I usually give is, for instance, though that's going to be like a very sort of commonplace example, but that's Gandhi, for instance. So Gandhi as an individual, he, at least the way I understand Gandhi, is that he he embodied in his life a very strong sense of place. His battle for wearing homespun, or the fact that you can make your own salt in the salt march. And I think that kind of that it actually strikes people. So I think it's very radical to challenge oneself that, well, I mean, who says that radical means having no normativity, right? So if you say, well, radical means no leash, well, then we have to discuss on the meaning of radical, and we will end up in a set of dichotomies. So, well, radical is no leash, and then what are you because you have a leash? But ultimately, I'm sure that in being radical, you implicitly, you also have to consider the leashes that you want to break away from. So there is a leash also in the being radical, in the sense that it's the leash that you want to move away from. But so it's very hard then to essentialize categories and say that's what it means to be radical. And I guess that doesn't mean that I exclude people that that come from other traditions. I think the postmodern tradition has done really a lot in many ways. But I find that there is the problem of postmodernism that I find, and I think Tala probably agree with this one, is that when you don't give, so when there is no idea of the main problem of postmodernism is that the moment you say there is no way of saying whether something is good or bad, or there is no way of, there is no substantive criteria for determining action, then you end up then you end up like the economists that say, well, then we'll just give you an instrumental rationality, and you do whatever, you do whatever you like depending on your own subjective preferences. And to quote Guido Calabresi, that seems like attacking the problem with shutters on. So since I cannot find out what makes people determine whether something is good or bad, well then I'll just work without it and go and keep going my way. So I think it's also a matter of, I think as social scientists, these are questions that ought to be asked. So well, then again, every academic work is also the product of one's personal inclinations. And so I guess that's sort of the kind of niche that I find myself comfortable with. So looking at small-scale action, so to say, and because I've sort of come to think that it's quite it's a dimension that people can control better than if we discuss the great systems, and then ultimately remains a discussion. So I always start to say when I say something, if I said something that I didn't then implement in my own life, I don't see the two things are being separate. And I find that, for instance, when we challenge discourse about things in an academic way, that actually prevents us from having, so then we have rules for having academic discourse, and then we have rules for what's in and what's out. So maybe I'm out, depending on some notion of academia. But maybe then we should also have to reconsider that notion of academia and say, well, where do such more individualized and not always at the systemic level discussions stand? In relation to them, so I hope that sort of answers your question, though it was a very multifaceted question, and I think I have not done it justice. So I apologize for that preemptively and actually post-emptively. And in relation to Bhabani's question, now I think we can agree to disagree in the sense that well, the reason I come to be interested in the individual and the power of ideas is because I'm not a pure materialist in the sense that I don't. And I think that's where the communitarian idea of authenticity maybe fails, is that it leads to, but that's just my opinion, right? So it leads to a kind of over-social view, whereas I'm more interested in, for instance, Gramscian scholarship and the power that common sense has of its own. So communication and ideas have a life of their own, beyond material conditions, which of course affect them. I'm not denying this dimension. So I guess that was maybe my professional deformation that made me to focus on conceptions of the individual, because I was very interested in Gramsci. I think it would probably be another paper if I focused on material conditions. But that doesn't mean, of course, that there are many points of contact, as I also tried to say in Marxist scholarship. So again,
one thought is that if you take the idea that individuals invest, so I think you confuse something. One is that the individual is a place where we can understand how things are operating, and then the other is what do you do about it. So just talking about how do we do something about it. You say individuals are like we should have individual agency, maybe even opt-out, and that's the way we can best approach the problem. That's what I hear you saying. So let's just take that in a concrete example. So the biggest problem I have is just like it feels very abstract. So let's take healthcare in America, right? A lot of people don't have healthcare in America. And what you hear on one side is, well, they don't have healthcare not because they're lazy or they don't want it, it's because the possibilities just aren't there, right? For lots of reasons. The other side says, let's not have any sort of nationalized, socialized, any of that. What we want is to make sure that individuals have the capacity to choose the healthcare that they want, right? So the argument, right, something like that. So the argument I hear is individuals can best control their actions. Well, if I say that to the individual, we'll know that, well, probably the best way you would start getting health insurance is not by individually calling up your potential HMO plan and trying to negotiate with them in some sort of like Smithian thing, right? It would be you're getting together and you're doing something collectively and you recognize that there's a cost-benefit analysis and there's going to be losers and nevertheless you push, right? Something like that. And that seems oftentimes how anything gets done in a meaningful way for a lot of people, right? Whether that's formalization of property rights or healthcare or whether or not we go to war, it's not whether you decide to go to war, it's whether the machinery is going to do it or not, right? And it really won't matter on that individual level, right? So I would just put that to it. I don't know in concrete practice where this model, how this works.
Well, so first of all, I will not engage with the healthcare reform just because I will end up saying blunders. I'm not familiar with that. I haven't studied it enough. I haven't talked to people involved in it.
I'm sorry, take the example of the water debate going on here.
Mm-hmm.
So you want like the issue of privatization of water?
Well, I mean, in relation to that, I feel that, so what I'm advocating for is the fact that it's probably against the very idea of cost-benefit analysis, in the sense that, so that the idea of, I mean, meaningful problems get solved with cost-benefit analysis, and those problems get solved because maybe we need cost-benefit analysis because the scale of our society is such that we have nothing else, so that there's no room for feelings in the WTO, right? So the reason that I speak about the individual is because I would like to cast the question of an economics of scale. So why do we not start challenging and thinking, well, is the current scale of the economy, the current scale of human interaction, is that even appropriate? So or does it actually not force us into having to resort to a constantly intellectual way of solving things? So cost-benefit analysis. So I guess that is probably the what do you think? Yeah. So this is essentially what I say when I advocate an individual dimension. I don't know actually how I'm going to solve healthcare problems with that, or trade problems. I think that it's just important to try and understand how scale possibly affects our decision making and prevents us from having different types of conversations. And so, for instance, in relation to like healthcare, for instance, right? What the debate that we have around healthcare is centered on the fact that we have a certain technology that allows us to lengthen individuals' lives. And one of the problematic questions about technology is that it allows you to narrow down certain interests and provide for a selective catering of those interests. So when we focus, so taking it on a very individual level, and I don't mean to imply anything on the healthcare debate, because otherwise I'm going to get people punching me. But I think, when we take, say, healthcare problems, as you're saying, well, we should give people healthcare because everybody's entitled to live up to 80 years. And this is, to me, is living in a dichotomy, because it assumes that, so you cannot be dead while you're living. So is it really worth to live until 80? What does it mean for other generations in terms of sustainability? There's a wide ecological literature actually discussing the problem of overshoot in our. So I don't mean to say that we should not provide healthcare as a form of population control. No Malthusianism works. But I think that it is important, however, to ask one's questions and how, say, let's have a debate about healthcare. That already assumes that, well, healthcare should be given to everybody because living as long as I can is what I have. But that assumes then that if I live a consumeristic lifestyle in addictions and I'm actually never free because I'm addicted, then is that life? Or is that a meaningful life? Do we not have death in life? So the fact that we are kind of projected in sort of lost in these dichotomies, I guess it also affects the types of debates I have. Again, in relation to the healthcare system, I don't know. And if I went and told this to somebody who doesn't have healthcare, I'm sure I will be getting a fuck you right away. So then again, the point is when you have theories again, they're always born in a certain, they're kind of a little plant that you grow in a certain pot. And so when you try to make that plant and say, well, then let's put it everywhere, maybe that plant is not really right to grow on other grounds. So I actually take your point, and that's something we have to be careful. I don't want to come up with a new systemic solution to the problems. Actually, I think it's more a question to me of sort of individual problems, and actually it's relativized by the fact that I'm a Western man. So in this challenge with Bhabani, I don't know how this can apply to, say, non-Western peoples, for instance. So yeah, it's always important to be sober, to be sober, and not to have a kind of to assume that this theory is the theory that will solve all our problems. Probably isn't. Yes.
I have a question. I want to know what you think about the individuality, and because throughout the representation you talked about individual and abstract forms of answer, and in a way you try to talk about individual remixing self-identity. You also use psychology and all this to talk about it. I mean, this is all like using ideas to talk about individuality, where I think individuality is about knowing oneself and being oneself. So I want to know, is that using other people's ideas of what individuality is, and talking about individuality in an abstract form, what you personally think, that how can we break away? Because so far what I'm getting is everything is being influenced by one form or another. What do you personally think that individualism should be, and how we can break out from all these external influences, which makes us who we really are in society?
It's an interesting question. I believe that the main problem is that. Sorry, I had something in mind. I forgot. I'm reading something. So So you said, knowing yourself, and I find that there is the main problem I personally find, but that's just from my own sort of two eyes, is that of projection. So that all too often, when we're sort of losing an ability to be emotionally literate. So we're like Fukuoka's trees that have been pruned in such a way that if you stop pruning them, then they rot. Knowing how to develop that, so I cannot claim to be emotionally literate at all, or what it means to be emotionally literate. But I do feel, at least say from my personal life, that I've had times when I was sort of there is a feeling, and you don't want to kind of stay with it and say, well, maybe this feeling is telling me something about my predicament, and maybe if it's telling me something about my predicament, maybe other people feel it too, and then maybe this is a meaningful question that ought to be asked in an academic setting. And the fact that we don't do that, I guess, it is very strongly influenced by the paradigm we have of medicalization of these conditions. So when people, I was once talking to to a friend, for instance, and she's living in a 4x2 room, very, very small room, and she tends to get a bit down when she's in that room because there's no light. It's like a small jail. And she told me, well, I cannot be alone. And I thought, well, so maybe the problem is not that you cannot be alone. It's not your individual problem. It's not that you're psychologically unstable. Maybe, it's the room that is a 4x2 room, which is like this big, and it feels like a prison, and you don't get enough light, and so on and so forth. So there is when I mentioned also the self-help market, it's a system that is very robust in the sense that even if people try to double guess their feelings, then they are already directed to a sort of institutional treatment that sort of tells them, no, it's just a problem, it's an individual problem, and people never come together to seek to discuss. But actually, there is some psychological literature showing how things like depression are actually very ubiquitous in a society that we have very high standards of material welfare. But how about our emotional welfare? And so, actually, about these things, there's a series of movements that are popping up. One of these is the degrowth movement, which, for instance, says we focus too much on material well-being and on the fact that the economy has to grow. And in order to keep it growing, as she has and I tried to mention in the institutional critique, we have to fuel new needs in people. But actually, how about well-being understood more broadly, not just as the amount of possessions? When economists try to measure the quality of life, the quality of life is a quality which you have to perceive in a very multifaceted way. It's not how many cars I have, how long I live, and where I study. So they turn quality of life into quantity of life, and this model is quality of life. So there is a problem even in the way we talk about issues, and I find it very difficult. And it may be the fact that it takes place in a sort of Western academic setting that forces us to have to couch our arguments in a kind of intellectual way, and then when you do that, it becomes very difficult to sort of move back away from it and see, well, what else are we losing? And I think one of the main benefits of critique is to be aware that it's looking from its own two eyes and that it's context specific. And I find it troublesome with academia that. And with an intellectual academic discourse, that it actually totalizes itself as knowledge. So knowledge is what is made in universities. There is no other knowledge that maybe people have, that maybe rural people have in the land. Maybe well, this is an example, a ubiquitous example that I give to Alfonso all the time. So he comes from Bolivia, where they have people worshipping the Mother Earth, right? And that kind of religious belief, which you kind of look upon and say, well, these people are animists and they believe in the Mother Earth, actually maybe discloses some knowledge about sustainable ways of living in your environment. And I guess that the moment you dismiss that as religion and that's not knowledge, then you have lost a chance to ask a question and to advance your academic discourse. I'm not saying that we should do away with academia, but I think that if according to you, knowledge was a fourfold path, so to say. And so the moment you privilege only one, you're losing three. So I guess there should be, a mix of things. And that's all I can say.
Why don't we take a break, and then we'll come back and do one more talk and we'll have lunch. Is that good for everybody? Okay.